So we have two guest speakers with us today. Ramona Madosing Hector from the University of Florida IFAS Extension. A lot of you met Ramona at the last working group meeting and at our last seminar. Ramona spoke for us. So we've borrowed Ramona again and asked her to help us with this conversation today. We have Dr. Bob Sluka. A lot of you know Bob. He's part of our group. And he is going to talk about some projects that he works on that are sustainability related. And then y'all know me, and I'll wrap us up today with a little bit of discussion about communication. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Ramona and let you get us going.
Okay, thank you, Linda. So here's an outline of what we're hoping to cover in the time that we will have with you today. Systems thinking, sustainability definitions. Bob's going to take a look at sustainable development goals in action. We'll provide a little bit of an overview. Linda and I will tackle communication strategies and metrics, and certainly we'll have some time for Q&A at the back end of the session. Next slide. So when we think about sustainability, what do we think about? This is a definition from the World Commission on Environment and Development, essentially known as the Brundtland Report from 1987. So that date should stand out in your mind when we think about sustainability and the origins of sustainability. So development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. So if I had wanted to underline, which I didn't, words that would stand out or words that we want us to commit to our minds, it would be needs. We think about wants versus needs. We think about biological needs. So thinking about our needs in the present without compromising future. So I think this definition is usually the one that's used or that you see in sustainability action reports, and just think about how long it's been around, 1987. On the next slide, we have a little bit of a timeline of sustainability, and I started building this from 1970, the first Earth Day. So some of us will remember that in terms of what that sparked in terms of environmentalism, but then looking at 1987, so it took us 17 years later to actually see the sustainable development definition come through. And then again, another number of years before we had the first Earth Summit, 1992, with the United Nations Framework Convention meeting in Brazil. And that really set the stage for a lot of future goals that you would see that come forward as it relates to sustainability and climate change. The Kyoto Protocol in 1997 that looked at reducing greenhouse gas emissions based on consensus of the meetings in 1992, and recognizing that perhaps that might have been based on anthropogenic causes. So definitely go look up Kyoto Protocol and the Earth Summit. The Dow Jones Sustainability Indices, I think it's important for us to think about sustainability and measurement, and these came about in 1999. So definitely having metrics to communicate what we're hoping to measure and manage in such a way that we can actually see the change in the system. In 2000, we have the Millennium Development Goals, and we'll talk a little bit about that further on in the session today. And 2015, the Millennial Development Goals became the Sustainable Development Goals. We had the Paris meetings in 2015, which was the climate meeting. So those were co-located, if you would, within that same year with an emphasis on addressing climate change. So I think it's good for us to think about where we started in 1970. That really became the basis in the United States for a lot of the air and water and environmental regulations that we see in terms of what has we done to protect water and quality of life in those areas, and then nationally and globally, what is occurring to address sustainability. Next slide. When we think further about sustainability, we think about the three pillars, so environment, economy, and society. And that's really been the crux of what we see with the 1987 definition, that when we think about the needs of the future, present and future, we need to think about them in terms of these pillars. Sometimes in a corporate environment, you tend to find it referred to as the people, planet, profit argument. And Linda will advance just a couple more mouse clicks to get us to see all of the animations come through. Perfect. So the people, planet, profit is the triple bottom line. This is usually, again, the corporate definition of how they are going to achieve sustainability within the company, looking both at their people population, their employees, but also looking at their bottom line. So again, using that terminology of bottom line, which is what you associate with profit-driven for-profit companies, but considering it within the sustainability framework. In general, we think about sustainability as a sweet spot, which was the intersection of all of those: economy, environment, society. Thank you, Linda. So let's look at it on the next slide. When we talk about the culture of sustainability, and Linda's going to dive into communicating sustainability. When we think about sustainability, our goal is to really create a culture and an ethic of sustainability that really looks at people. How do people think? How do people feel, if you would? How is their culture being supported for sustainability in terms of their company, in terms of their personal decisions? So personal and professional come to mind. So when we think of where we are right now with the pandemic, you look at what your environmental footprint might be. Right now, it's a little bit different than if you were commuting to an office every day. You're using supplies at home versus in the office. You might be purchasing things a little bit more differently in terms of making sure you have access to supplies. You might have seen supply chain shortages in terms of the things that you would typically buy. So you might be approaching it with a more eco-conscious perspective. So that's the planet piece. And then also in terms of your own economic situation. So sustainability really runs the realm or the gamut of indicators, if you would, both on an employee basis, on a personal and professional basis. So think about applying all of those people, planet, profit elements to your own situation and how they would apply as well within your company to create a culture of sustainability, that we begin to view all of our decisions with sustainability. That's great, Linda. So again, connecting that to that notion of culture of sustainability, we really want to think about the interconnectedness of these systems. And I think that is what really differentiates sustainability from environmentalism or green. A lot of people sometimes think, oh, it's just, you're talking about green, the green movement, or you're talking about environmental. But sustainability is meant to be so much more. It's holistic. It looks at all of these systems together. And this is why we talk about a systems approach or a systems perspective when we think about sustainability, because it is balancing so much. You know, our social system is made up of a lot of other systems. Think about housing, think about access to childcare, think about transportation, but those also have connections to our economics. Is it cost effective? Can you afford to access it? Does everybody have access to it? And then environmentally, what resources are being used to build schools, to provide housing, to provide places for people to work? So so much more goes into decision making when we think about sustainability from a systems perspective. And then interdisciplinary. So today, Linda is a community development specialist. She's had a background in horticulture. I have an urban planning and environmental science background, but Bob has marine biology as his background. So all of us together are able to bring our discipline content to approaching sustainability and to talking about sustainability and the challenges we face. And then lastly, we think about measuring and documenting and reporting outcomes and impacts. And I know when we've spoken before at the working group meetings and the seminars, we want to be able to document what we're doing with sustainability. And in order to make that accessible to everyone, we need to use common metrics and common language and common terms, which we talked about a little bit the last time. Next slide. So I just wanted to bring out this term again, systems thinking. When we think about systems, it's like, well, what are systems? Well, our body is a system. The earth is a system. There are other complex systems, if you would, that are nested together. So complex systems, systems within systems, which is why we think of sustainability as so much more than just one element. It's a systems approach. It's a systems need. And what happens when you have so many systems embodied in other systems is that we have places within that system or ecosystem, if you would, where you have things change. And things that change in one part of the system will have an impact in another part of the system. So even your car. So that might be a good example. Think of your car as well as a system. If you don't put the brake fluid in, then your brakes doesn't work and the car doesn't stop. So those are all things that can happen. And the terminology of tipping points and butterfly effect, you might have seen these before. or heard of these before. So tipping points tend to be things that are referred to as turning points, such as small changes that can have larger impacts or shifts that might create a new state, if you would. And the butterfly effect comes from chaos theory that also refers to how these small changes can have unexpected and unpredictable results. And when we think of that in the complex system of Earth, you know, I want you to tell me if you can think of some examples of tipping points in nature. You may have seen it in some of the readings that you have done. Maybe you've seen some of these things on the news. Everybody is thinking with their citizen science hat on of what things used to be like and what they are now as we continue to see changes within our environmental system. So if you have any examples of tipping points, feel free to put those into the chat box. Linda says algal blooms. Yep, that's a good example. We have small changes create a major impact in another system. Bob talks about coral reefs. Holly referred to wildfires or prescribed burns, right? So you have one thing that can create something else, but it's necessary or needed, but you also have to mitigate for those effects in other parts of the system. Very good, thank you. Next slide. So here we're just gonna spend a few brief minutes on the Millennium Development Goals. These came about in 2000. There were 8 of them. And the reason why this is important is because in 2015, the United Nations decided that they were going to evolve into a post-2015 agenda. And they reframed those 8 goals into what is now considered the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. So Linda, on the next slide, what we have are the dates, if you would. So they were adopted in 2015 with a goal of looking at the progress that will be made in 2030. And then on the next slide that comes after this one, we look at all of these goals. Next slide, perfect. So we see 1 to 17 in greater detail. So looking at the first one, it's no poverty. Looking at number 7, it's affordable and clean energy. Looking at number 11, it's sustainable cities and communities. Number 12 is responsible consumption and production. So if you look at all of these titles of the Sustainable Development Goals, within each of those would then be additional indicators and action plans. And I think we can all see where our work, if you would, our work as sustainability professionals or interested sustainability advocates can be connected to any one of these goals. And the goals are meant to be globally interpreted, globally applied. So you might look at something like zero hunger and you might say, well, we don't have that in America. Well, we do. We do have pockets of places where we will have food insecurity and we want to ensure that there is little hunger in communities. So looking at our entire food system and how we have policies to address food distribution is going to address a goal like zero hunger. And I think with the recent pandemic and the situation of seeing what our farmers were dealing with and produce in the fields and milk being thrown away, it shows you again how our system and the nature of the structure of the system can impact a goal like number 2, which is zero hunger. So I think that Bob is going to spend some time now looking at number 14, and we'll be turning it over right here. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Ramona. That was an excellent introduction. I think I want to specifically talk about number 14, the life underwater. This is a picture of my son, possibly inappropriately handling a marine animal, but I think what I wanted to picture was the joy in his face. And I think the exciting thing about the SDGs is that, and the revolutionary aspect of it, is that it's actually including the environment along with human indicators. So those of us who are really concerned about our planet and the 71% of it that is ocean, this is a way of actually reaching out to and integrating and working with those who are primarily interested in people and their health and well-being. And the Sustainable Development Goals show how these interact significantly. And it gives us, like Ramona said, a common way of talking about things. Next slide, please. I include this, you know, this was a picture of a man from Borneo, the Bajau Lot, the sea nomads, and this is one of their places that they live for part of the year. when there's stormy season. And in so many places around the world, people are highly dependent upon the ocean. And it's often the poorest of the poor who are most dependent. And we're hearing all over the world right now with people losing their jobs, people are going out into the ocean because that's the place. If they don't own any land, the ocean is the last place where someone who's landless can go and try to find food in a way that doesn't cost them money. But as these guys have to go out farther and farther for their food and, you know, catching less and less, it really does show very dramatically the interaction between something like trying to combat hunger with the sustainability issues within the ocean. Next slide. So as Ramona said, there's a way, each of these sustainable development goals, there's a lot of detail underneath each, and I'm not gonna go into all of that, but just to notice this, for the ocean, the biggest broad level goal is to conserve and sustainably use the oceans, seas, and marine resources for sustainable development. So very broad. So what does that mean? You can see there beneath this right here, targets and indicators. So under this goal, there's a number of different targets and then indicators. So how do we actually measure that? And you can see that you could actually go in and look and see how are we progressing? How do we do in 2016, 2017, 2018, and so on. So this one I want to specifically talk about and try to say, you know, what does this maybe look like? The target 14.1 is about reducing marine pollution of all kinds, and this includes marine debris, or as we might call it, mostly plastic, in our ocean. So this is something that our organization has tried to take on globally, but also here locally in Brevard County. Next slide, please. So this is out at Canaveral National Seashore. The next slide, if you can go to, is a close-up here of my hand. This is a plastic pellet, also known as a nurdle. Almost everything that is made of plastic starts out as this. And so one of our important questions we were trying to do to try to look at marine debris is how are these nurdles showing up on our shores here in Brevard County? What are the sources? What are the sinks? So part of this task is also research, just understanding what is the state of our coastlines in regards to microplastic pollution. Next slide, please. This is Cocoa Beach, and that little white line there in the sand is actually tiny pieces of plastic. And so you can see that it's heading towards that little place where the kid is playing. And as we walked along, there was a volunteer. We were doing an exercise in education here. And the person I was with just didn't even notice this microplastic, and nor do I imagine many of the folks there did as well. Next slide, please. This is Canaveral National Seashore. So even a place without development, you can see there the plastic on the beach. Next slide, please. So one of the things that we're trying to do is to look at the types and abundance of microplastics. So this is a young university student who came and spent some time with us learning how to do microplastic research. So an important part of these sustainable development goals is capacity development, training younger people in order to be able to do these types of things. And then we were able to study these types of microplastics. And if we can determine where they're coming from, we can look for sources and try to begin the process then of reducing this microplastic pollution on our beaches. Here is a slide. We did an education event as part of one of our activities. And so also making people aware of these issues is really important in terms of helping them understand the negative impacts of microplastics and some of the issues that are surrounding this this whole issue. So this is just one of the ways in which our organization here locally is trying to do this. We have a link with Satellite Beach, a small private faith-based school called Coastal Community School. So our organization is faith-based, and so I was able to go into their school and talk with them through their values about why microplastics are an important issue for them, not just scientifically, but also for them in their own faith. And they've started monitoring some of the nurdle abundance on some of their beaches. So it's something that we've tried to integrate with citizen science. So it's a way to help others get involved in this. Just to go into another very short example, you can see another target there, 14.2, is about sustainably managing marine protected areas and coastal ecosystems. And also that 14A, increasing our scientific knowledge and developing research capacity and transferring this kind of technology. Next slide. I mentioned our organization is global. This is about 50 yards away from our research center in Kenya, on one of the prettiest beaches in East Africa, and also one of the East Africa's oldest marine protected areas. Next slide. This is a critically endangered Halavi guitarfish. So you probably are familiar with the IUCN Red List. So if you remember about Sustainable Development Goals, it's both about people, place, and including animals. So one of the things that we're trying to do is studies and working with the local community, again, in education and to help them to understand why it's really important to conserve this particular fish. Next species, or next slide, please. This is the seagrass beds. You probably know from maybe hearing about an Indian River Lagoon how important they are for storing carbon. They're also an important place for young fish to develop that then can later on move offshore and they can be caught by fishermen. So it's an important part of that cycle. Conserving these seagrass beds isn't just about biodiversity conservation, it's also about helping protect fisheries for people. Next slide, please. And this is a group of Muslim fishermen, the East African coast. The fishermen are predominantly Muslim. So I think this is a really interesting example of how we as a primarily Christian organization are trying to serve this community and developing these ties. And we're united, even though our faiths are different, by wanting to protect this area, but also wanting to provide for these guys as they go out and fish and for their families. So next slide, please. This is, and capacity development then is also really important part of this project. These are two, myself there on the left, and two young Kenyan marine biologists and a German marine biologist. We're out looking at, and I'm training them on how to study these kinds of resources. Next slide, please. So I think the exciting thing for me, those are just two examples of how we're, integrating them in specific places. These SDGs, while they're general, are, have to be implemented very specifically in a particular place. And so if you want to learn more about how we're doing that, you can see the websites down there. But I think what I would just finish with is encouraging you to think, especially if your heart's more towards protecting the environment, this is a great way to really look at working with others who might have little other emphases, particularly related to humans, but there's a synergy between people and place that's really captured by these sustainable development goals. So I'm happy to talk offline if something interests you, or later if there's questions and answers, I'm happy to answer any questions on that. So,
okay, we should have time at the end, Bob, for questions. Yeah. That's great. Was someone trying to say something? Somebody have a question? Okay, thought I heard someone. All right. Ramona, I'll turn it back to you.
Okay, so we're going to discuss a little bit about performance metrics, and I think we heard a little bit about Bob mentioning that before, but we started in the beginning of how do you know what you're doing is working, and how do you assess that from a local government perspective, which will be the frame that I'll be using to present in this next session. Next slide. So here in Florida, many communities are using standards from these three that are on the screen for assessing what their local government is doing as it relates to sustainability. So when we started in the beginning, we talked about sustainability in general. We looked at definitions, and then we looked at the global framework, something like the Sustainable Development Goals. But every city is going to approach it very differently. And each of these standards here allows you to see where sustainability fits within that framework. And it also allows you to assess gaps, if you would, in terms of what you are doing and how you might compare either with Florida communities or with other national and international communities. So the Florida Green Local Government is offered through the Florida Green Building Coalition. So this is a standard for local governments. You, of course, as with many other things that are standards and certifications, you have to have a fee. So these things are not free, but as a local community, you might want to engage in that process. And even if you don't pay to be certified, it's just like many other things. You can use the tools to help you build a sustainability plan, to help you assess where your gaps are, so that you know what you ought to and should be thinking about when you think about looking at your sustainability action plan. So Florida Green Building Coalition, Florida specific. LEED for Cities and Communities is through the U.S. Green Building Council, a national and international focus. And STAR Communities actually merged with LEED for Cities, so now they are under that same framework, but I'll be sharing some metrics with each of these standards as we go along. Great. So here are some of the reasons why we want to be able to do some of these standards. So when we think about the benefits of a local government standard, recognition. Why? Because it gets you grants. What does grants do? It gets you money, which you can then use to support your own programs. So education programs, something like what Bob is doing with microplastic education could be supported through a grant that you would apply for. And when you apply for this grant and say, well, City of Satellite Beach is a certified STAR community, or it's a certified LEED community, and we want to be able to use this money to do a comprehensive community program on microplastic education and awareness. And how does that lead into a policy, if you would, for how you might better address sustainability? So in general, all of these performance standards can help you hone in and work on a holistic plan, if you would, for your community. And even if you didn't pay for it, you still are going to be able to get a sense of what you're doing well and what you might want to improve in the future.
Yeah, and I think, Ramona, maybe another time we can, just do a seminar on those metrics and, really do a deep dive into those metrics, what they mean and stuff. So for the sake of time today, we decided not to, dive into those metrics. So if that's something that y'all have an interest in learning more about, the specifics of Florida Green Building and LEED and STAR communities, let us know, and we'll put together a seminar for you on that and do it.
So Linda, before we move ahead, though, I do want to mention, since the topic today is communicating principles and goals and process, many of these standards, if not all of them, give you credit for having a sustainability professional. Somebody who looks at it from an integrative perspective across all of your departments in your city or your community of how you're addressing sustainability. And I think that's the value of how you could use a tool from either one of those certification groups to allow you to think through the process of what sustainability might look like within the community or the local government, and how a position as a sustainability coordinator or a director or associate, even program assistant, just somebody who can direct your efforts under the umbrella of sustainability.
Right. Thank you, Ramona. So in talking about communication strategies, this is a whole webinar in and of itself, because there's so many things that we can talk about here. But I'm going to briefly touch on just a few things that hopefully will help you in communicating sustainability, working on your boards, working with elected officials, working with decision makers, or just working with people in your community. So when we think about communication, we think about the internal communication, the external communication, and the community. How do you communicate with the community? So internally, we talked our last seminar was about working on a board, and how do we communicate within our board, and how do we communicate with our city liaison if we are a sustainability board, and all of those things are important, and we'll touch on that. And then externally, how do we communicate with those perhaps in the city who we are trying to convince to accept these sustainability plans that we're working on? How do we communicate with perhaps contractors that we're trying to secure for projects? And the list goes on, right? There are a lot of external people with whom we're going to communicate. And then a community in itself, how do we get people in a community, or how do we get a community to change behavior and to adopt sustainability principles. And, you know, looking at those SDGs, you know, there's so many different ways that we can impact a community. And so there are a lot of different ways that we can communicate to the community the things that we would love to see them change. And so we're going to talk about some of those things as we move forward. So I'd like to hear from you guys. I'd like for this to be a little bit interactive. You know, what is the most important part of communication? What do y'all think? You can type it in the chat box, or you can unmute yourself and just holler it out. What do you think? Mandy said clarity. Kelsey said knowing your audience. Two-way communication. Those are all excellent answers. Anyone else want to throw one out there?
I was just going to say being able to communicate in ways others can actually understand. You can't just speak science because there's, you know, not that many scientists out there.
Right, right. And that's hard to do, isn't it? That's not always easy to do. So one of the most important parts of communication, if we're talking about two-way communication, we're talking about communication individually, one-on-one, or even within a group. 55% of our communication is done verbally. It's done through physical cues, body movements, face. You know, if you got your arms folded over, have you ever had a communication or a conversation with someone who has their arms crossed? You know, what are they saying to you? They're in a defensive posture, aren't they? So that sends all kinds of signals, you know, whether you're aware of those signals or not, it's sending signals. And then next is the voice tone modulation and all the pauses. And pauses can be very impactful, right? And I think especially via the webinar platform, I think I've learned that pauses, I have to learn to appreciate those pauses in Zoom land, right? When it's a face-to-face group meeting or something, you know, you can tell when people are thinking, but in Zoom land, you can't really tell what's going on. So, you know, a pause is a little bit harder to tolerate in a webinar or online situation. Voice tone, you know, that's really important as well. You know, if someone says to you, wear a mask, you know, you're going to take that, you know, you're going to be defensive towards that. But if someone says, you know, wear a mask, you know, that's going to create a different kind of conversation, isn't it? So you really have to think about that. And then 7%, this is what I really want you all to remember, only 7% of communication is via words. So, you know, we're really quick to write things. We want to write newsletters. We want to send an email. Some people are avid tweeters, whatever you call them. Some people are, you know, big Facebookers. But remember, only 7% of that information is really going to be impactful from a communication standpoint. So yeah, the verbal cues, the physical cues are really important. But here's some things about listening that I think you all need to know. 85% of what we've learned is through listening, not talking or reading. So while we might be avid readers, some of us, really, most of our knowledge or most of what we've learned has come from listening, just simply listening. 75% of the time we are distracted, preoccupied, or forgetful. How many of you have already been distracted in the last 30 minutes? I have, I'll admit, you know, especially when Ramona was talking, I just shut down. No, I'm kidding. I didn't do that to Ramona. But yeah, and I think that's even more of a challenge virtually, right? Because when we're all sitting in the room together, I can tell if you're checking your email or you're Facebooking on your phone, but right now I can't tell what you're doing. So that gets to be even more of a challenge. So, you know, when I want you to think about these in terms of communicating sustainability to your audiences, whoever that might be, you know, whether it's to an organization or it's to your board members or it's to your elected officials, whoever it is, when you are talking to them about sustainability, 75% of the time, they're not listening to you. Okay, that's really important to understand. After listening to someone talk, we can immediately recall about 50% of what was said. So if I were to ask you now to recall what I just said, some of you are going to probably be able to repeat 50% or recall 50% of what I said. That's an average, okay? So some of you are going to be a little less, some of you are going to be a little more. So, and if you don't like me and you don't like the subject that we're talking about, that number's even lower. So imagine if you're trying to convince someone to adopt a policy or to change policy within a city government on renewable energy, and they don't like you, right? Or they really don't care about renewable energy. You know, how effective are you going to be? Probably not very effective. It's something to think about there. And then 1 hour later, we remember less than 20% of what we heard. You know, so there's lots and lots and lots of research on education and how we educate people, and we know that we need to have something in writing so people can see it, and then we need to say it. And we also know that we need to say it again, and we need to say it again, and we have to repeat it in order for people to remember it. Because in an hour, you all are only going to remember 20% of what Ramona said, or 20% of what Bob said. Hopefully everything I said. And then less than 2% of the population has had formal education on how to listen. How many of you, hands up, have had formal education on how to listen? Yeah, so there you go. And you know, listening isn't easy. I'm one of those people, and I know this about myself. I'm one of those people, when you are telling me a story, or you are trying to convince me of something, or you're telling me about a problem, I'm looking for the solution before you even finish, right? I just tune out and I start thinking, well, you know, here's the solution to that, or, you know, those kinds of things. So remember that the person you're talking to may not be actively listening. So think about that. And there are lots of tools and resources out there to learn how to active listen. And it's something that you have to practice a lot. Again, that's a whole nother webinar in and of itself. So the last couple of slides are going to be about something that we call community-based social marketing. Did I skip a slide? No, I didn't skip a slide. I thought there was one in there. So community-based social marketing, that's not about Facebook, okay? It doesn't have anything to do with Facebook or Twitter. We're talking about social marketing. And this is, how do we persuade people to change behavior? You know, it's well and good, you guys, to tell your next door neighbor, hey, you need to be recycling your plastic, or hey, you need to use less plastic, right? It's well and good that you tell them that. But what did we just say? We said that 75% of the time they're not completely listening to you. They're only going to remember 50% of what you said. An hour later, they're only going to hear 20%. And if they don't really like the topic, which if they aren't recycling, they might not like the topic, they're really not going to hear much of what you have to say anyway. So with that in mind, we have to have strategies that are going to persuade people to change behavior. And you might have to change a little bit of how you think about some of these things when we go through these. So the social-based, community-based social marketing is all about using strategies to get people to change their behavior. And when I say change behavior, that could be to get an elected official to vote in favor of a policy change. Maybe it's to get the city council to create a new position for a sustainability professional. And those people do exist, people who have degrees in sustainability. And so, you know, you have to think about, you know, where might you use these tools, these strategies, and how might they benefit your goals. So the first one is to use captivating information. So if you're approaching someone or you're approaching a group to talk about something like, oh, pick a sustainability topic. Someone pick one. Ramona, give me one. It's been a long day. We're not thinking. Somebody give me a sustainability topic.
I think the solar panels are renewable electric vehicle stations, charging stations in your
community. Electrical vehicle charging stations. Thank you. All right, so you're going before the council, or your sustainability board is developing a plan or a proposal for vehicle charging stations. We'll call those EV charging stations. All right. So what are you going to call that? Right? What are you going to title that? You know, that's important, because how you title that is going to be important as to whether or not it even gets on the agenda, right? Because if the first thing they think is that this is some kind of tree hugger idea and you're going to cost them more money, they're probably not going to listen. So using captivating information, start with a story. I think someone in the chat box, Lisa, said, you know, personal stories. Those are always great ways to catch people's attention. Know your audience. What do they care about? You really need to understand the values. I think Bob was talking about when you were working with the Muslim fishermen, and you have people of two different faiths working together, but they shared a common value, and that was they valued the fisheries resources. That was important to both of those groups. And so because they had a common value, they were able to work together on that issue. So know your audience and use a credible source. Whatever the sources of information you are using to present your case, whatever that case may be, make sure you're using a credible source. All right, and again, that could be a whole nother webinar too, is, you know, how do you determine whether something's credible? You know, is it a peer-reviewed science journal article? Is it good science? Is it bad science? All of those things. Framing your message, and this is probably one of those top things that I would say you really need to think about is framing the message. If you go to one of those elected officials or that city council and you say, you need to install EV charging stations because there are people visiting the city who have electric cars. Well, that may not resonate with them. You know, you may not have framed that in such a way that they see the value in that, or that speaks to their personal values or their values as an elected official. You may have to do a little homework and find out, what do they care about? You know, do they care about transportation? Do they care about underserved audiences in the city? Do they care about economy? What do they care about? And you need to frame your message in such a way that it resonates with them and it speaks to what they care about. Consider the use of threatening messages carefully. You know, and I've heard some of these, you know, if you don't start saving water, we're going to run out of water. Well, who's going to believe that, right? That's really hard to believe, especially in Florida when we're surrounded by water. So consider those really carefully. Decide on a one-sided versus a two-sided message. There's a lot of discussion about that. You know, if there are two sides to an issue, do you present both sides or do you just present one side? And that really depends a lot on the context and your audience. Make your message specific. You know, I like to tell people, you know, chunk it, right? Just deliver things in chunks. If you're coming to the city council with a strategic plan for sustainability and it's ginormous, you know, it's a really long, lengthy plan, you know, be prepared to meet some resistance because it's so large and it's not specific. It needs to be very, very specific. I always like to start when I'm presenting something like that to a group. I always like to start with just some bullet points, right? So here's what we're looking at, and then start giving them more and more information. Make your message easy to remember. That kind of goes with that message being specific. Provide personal or community goals. That's really important. You need to have some metrics in there. Ramona touched on metrics a little bit. Model sustainable behavior. So you don't want to walk in there with a styrofoam cup and say, hey, we need to, you know, ban styrofoam, right? And I would imagine most of the folks in this room right here are probably modeling sustainable behavior. Look for those community block leaders. Look for those champions of the community who can get on board, who you can get on board with you, who are interested in being advocates with you for whatever it is that you're trying to do. I think that's really important. Usually what we do is we start with, you know, we're a committee, we create these plans, and we have these really great ideas, and then we go to council and we say, this is what we want to do, and oftentimes we're met with resistance, when really the approach probably should be, you know, here we are, this board, let's bring in the community and ask them what they think. What do they want to see what do they want to see their city do with sustainability, rather than us making those decisions. And then when you go before the council, you take these community folks with you and you say, this is what the community said they want. That's the approach you really need to be thinking about doing. And then provide feedback. It's really important with whoever you're talking to provide some feedback so that everyone knows what's working, what's not working. That's a very important part of communication. you know, even if it was a small task that was just completed, you really need to provide that feedback. You know, there are a lot of resources out there on social marketing, and they're, you know, it's the science is showing that it's a really effective way to get people to change behavior. And again, like I said, that's another webinar in and all of itself, but we're running up against time here. It's 2:48, and I want to leave plenty of time for questions. And also, if any of the sustainability boards would like to share anything that they have going on, we would love to hear from them too. And just so I don't forget, I really want to thank Bob and Ramona for joining us today and for doing a great presentation. Sorry, Ramona, I cut you short there, but it's happened before, so it'll probably happen again. So anyway, do you guys have any questions? I'm going to stop sharing my screen so that everyone can see, so I can see everyone. And there's enough of us on the call here that we can have an open conversation, I think. Jennifer, Jennifer Schroeder in the chat box typed up something that I think is really relevant. She says, when I conduct trainings, I try to always ask participants at the beginning how they are personally connected to the topic. It helps engagement and recall. Absolutely. We usually call that the personal stake in the work that Ramona and Holly and I do. You know, what is your personal stake in this issue or this conversation we're about to have? That's a really good strategy. Questions, thoughts, comments, sustainability boards, anything going on you want to share?
Hi, this is Kelsey from the City of Cocoa Beach. I can provide just a brief update on what our Sustainability Committee is working on. Most of you know I'm the staff advisory representative for our committee, so working with them closely to implement a few different things. We had a gentleman from a program called the Beach Bucket Program approach us. Basically what that program is they would install beach cleanup stations at our beach accesses, so like a bucket, and I don't know if there's trash grabbers, I think it was just buckets, and then having our local businesses kind of become a part of that as well and sponsor a bucket. So getting them on board, and then also it could be possibly an incentive program for people to, you know, fill up a bucket with trash, take a picture of them with that bucket, and then take it to that business for, you know, a free appetizer or something like that. So we're really excited about that potential to engage with our local businesses on sustainability here.
That's really cool, Kelsey. Thank you for sharing that. That's really cool. I like that. Vanessa in the chat box asked me if I could elaborate on the one-sided message a little more. Sure. That's, let me think of a really good example. Let's say that, what's an issue that has two sides? Let's say fertilizer. That's always a good hot button topic. So, you know, fertilizing turf grass. Let's just say turf grass. That's even better. All right, turf grass. Right. So, you know, there's, you know, you could talk to people about the one-sided part of that is reduce the amount of turf grass that you have in your lawn to reduce fertilizers and pesticides and water use. That's the one-sided message right there. You stop there. However, you could say, you know, reduce the amount of turf grass in your lawn to reduce the fertilizers. Courtney said mass. No, Courtney, no. To reduce fertilizers, pesticides, and water use. But, you know, there's two sides to that story. Some people say, well, you know, turf grass does a really good job of absorbing leachates and helps to prevent erosion. So what if we just learn to manage our turf grass differently? You know, what if our expectations for turf grass was to change? So that's the two-sided message. And I'm sure you guys have some good examples. And if you think of one, please, you know, interject here and share one. Does that make sense, Vanessa? Does that make it a little bit more clear? And you know, sometimes that can, you know, if you go with both sides, that could be, you know, that could end up biting you in the end, or it actually could work to your advantage. So it just really depends on the situation. Yeah, the mask issue. Okay, wear your mask because science says so. Don't wear your mask because someone else said so. How's that? That's the two sides.
Hey, Linda,
Yeah.
I want to remind everybody, elections are coming up August 18th. This is a perfect time. The candidates are out there to talk to candidates, to get them to put sustainability in their platforms, to educate them. And it's a very good time for all of us to be active.
Yep, you're right, Susan. Thank you for that. Go vote.
Mhm.
We're probably preaching to the choir here, right, today.
Well, we all have something to say. Yeah.
That's right. That's right. Any other questions? Any other activities going on with your sustainability boards, or, Courtney, anything going on in Satellite Beach you want to share?
Sure, I can give you an update on the board. They are actually right now going through our landscape and tree code to determine if they want to make any changes to that. They're also they're reviewing all of the new comp plan changes for climate change. So that's a lot of work. So they've got I think Jennifer, it was about a 2-hour presentation at the last meeting for that. For that.
Yeah.
And they only really reviewed the first, chapter of the changes, and they're going to be going through the next ones, probably the next couple meetings. And then from there, it'll go on to the Planning Advisory Board and then go to council. So the board is starting to take on a more active role in the climate change issues. And then the city did receive $1 million muck removal state appropriation with this last state budget. So we're really excited about that. We are partnered with Indian Harbor Beach on that project. So we'll be just kind of continuing the county's dredging project that they are going in the Grand Canal now. And we'll be just moving further south until we get all the finger canals of Satellite Beach and Indian Harbor Beach done. So that will probably start in the next 2 years. The board is going to get a presentation at their next meeting on a different type of aeration project that we are going to be writing a grant with a local company for. And so that'll be a demonstration project that will be in one of our canals. And we did get as a city our first plant grant recipient, which we have a grant program through the National Estuary Program that we give to canal front owners. So they pull back their St. Augustine grass and plant living seawalls, living seawalls next to their real seawall. Trying to get mangroves in and try to keep fertilizer out of the canals.
Nice.
We did get our first recipient for that, and Nick has already been helping them install their new landscaping. So that was exciting. And when you get your first one, it's always good because it, it's like it gets the ball rolling, if you will, and people start talking about it, and then other people start coming in. So we're just kind of sitting back waiting for somebody to finally take the bait. Other than that, we have a lot of environmental projects going on. It takes a long time to go through them. But one thing, we've got the new public works building coming in, and that'll be solar ready, and we're already looking for a solar company and getting the plans done for that. So that building will be done in all solar as well. So that's about it.
That's great. Thank you, Courtney. Y'all are doing some really great things there. I was speaking with some board members for a city in Brevard the other day, and they took their strategic plan to the city, and the city just was just full of lots of reasons why none of those things would work. And so they're really, right now, they're feeling really deflated, that committee is. So
which one is it?
It's a city in Brevard.
Oh, okay. You don't want to say which city?
I'll say it was probably Cocoa.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So, it's frustrating, and but I just say keep trying, because someday you might grow up and be like Satellite Beach.
Well, it's interesting because when you have a city like Cocoa, we had similar issues in Titusville when I worked over there. When you have a city that has to deal with so much more, they have to deal with crime and poverty and real real big redevelopment, you know, joblessness. So they have a lot of issues there that, you know, when you get to council members, sometimes they feel like those override, or they're just so overwhelming that taking on something else is hard for them to wrap their heads around. What I tried to do in the past is try to connect the two together, you know, and, you know, tack on sustainability issues with the solutions for these other issues as well, you know. So I'm not real sure how their staff is handling all that, but it's always been a challenge when I worked in other cities. We're just fortunate in Satellite Beach, we just really don't have a lot of those problems. So, you know,
Right.
the city's able to focus on that. And so I don't, you know, it's a lot easier environment to work in. You know, it's definitely got, even though we don't have a large commercial tax base, we still have, you know, higher valued homes. And so we have the resources in many cases to do the projects, and, you know, and really to have the staff knowledge base to be able to go out and get the grants and stuff. So when I hear of other cities' challenges, I can understand them because I've been there before, you know.
Right, right. Yeah, and I appreciate you saying that, Courtney, because that was one of the reasons why we did want to talk about the SDGs today also, was to help the boards to understand that it's not just about, you know, charging stations and recycling and cleaning up the beaches and stuff. There's a lot more to it, you know, when we talk about sustainability. So I appreciate that. And we're right up against 3 o'clock. I want to thank all of you for coming today. And, you know, I'll stick around a little bit if some of you still want to ask questions and stuff. But thank you so much for coming. And I hope you all have a great weekend. And whatever you do, stay safe.
Thank you.
Thank you.